Israel has launched its biggest attack in Syria in decades. It's targeted dozens of Iranian positions it says were firing on its territory. Are the two countries inching closer to war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Israel's launched its most ferocious attack inside Syria since the war of October 1973. But now the target is Iran, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's ally. Just a day after the Trump administration walked out of the Iran nuclear deal, Israel accused Iran of firing rockets on the Golan Heights, which Israel occupies. Tehran says those claims are baseless. Israel responded by striking dozens of Iranian positions in Syria. The two sides have exchanged hostile rhetoric for years, but now there are signs of an open military conflict, putting the region on edge. We have a lot to get to with our guests, but first, Harry Fawcett reports from the occupied Golan Heights.
Cockpit video from Israeli warplanes as they carried out the largest and most prolonged airstrike in Syria since the start of its civil war. Israel says it hit dozens of Iranian military targets, as well as 5 Syrian anti-aircraft installations. Israel says it was a response after Iranian forces launched 20 rockets at Israeli targets in the occupied Golan Heights.
We have made it very clear that we are here to defend ourselves. Those who started this round of violence were the Iranians who attacked Israel. We responded accordingly, and we are now waiting to see how the Iranians will respond.
Israeli forces in the occupied Golan Heights were on alert for any further response. At the same time, local residents were told to go about their business as normal. Schools were open, no restrictions placed on large gatherings. Israel says of the 20 rockets that were fired towards the occupied Golan Heights from Syrian territory, they all either fell in Syrian territory or they were intercepted. What followed was a massive and prolonged response from the Israeli armed forces, a real escalation in the kind of force that Israel has so far been prepared to use within Syria. It's a message to deter any further such action, and it's also making the most of an opportunity to do as much damage to Iranian forces as possible. Israel's government has long warned of a growing threat from Iranian bases and missiles inside Syria. It seems to have decided to act sooner rather than later.
We have, of course, hit all the infrastructure. Not all, but almost all of the Iranian infrastructure in Syria. They must remember the saying, if it rains here, it will pour over there. And I hope that we finish this chapter and that everyone got the message.
Syrian state media said Syrian air defences had intercepted most of the incoming rockets over the capital, Damascus, but also confirmed that a radar station and a weapons storage site were struck. Iranian state television said Syria had given a, quote, crushing response to the Israeli attacks. The strikes were carried out hours after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Moscow, saying he'd come away confident that Russia would not prevent what he called Israel's freedom of action. A day later, a different tone from the Russian foreign minister.
We see this as a very alarming development. We believe that all issues must be resolved through dialogue. During our multiple contacts with the leadership of both Iran and Israel, including during yesterday's meeting between Putin and Netanyahu, we underlined the necessity of avoiding any actions that might be seen as mutually provocative.
For now, this latest flurry of cross-border violence has subsided, but all sides are aware that a new bar has been set for its intensity and that it could all too easily rise again.
All right, let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us in Tehran, Mohammed Mousavi, professor of political science at the University of Tehran and head of the U.S. Department at the Iranian Institute for European and American Studies. In West Jerusalem, Robbie Sabel, professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is former legal advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and former counselor at the Embassy of Israel to the United States. And in Cannes, Ali Vayez, director of the Iran Project at the International Crisis Group, who was part of the negotiations that led to the Iran nuclear deal. A warm welcome to you all. Ali, I want to start with you. Israel is now saying it has no intention to escalate this any further. Do you believe the worst is over, or is this only going to get worse?
The situation is very tense, so it can go either way. The risks are really high, and there's a lot of friction at the moment between Iran and Israel. And obviously in the aftermath of President Trump withdrawing from the nuclear deal, the tensions are even higher. But from my perspective, I think Israel is in a win-win situation, because if you consider options that Iran would either demonstrate restraint because of its own calculations at this moment, it needs to have the Europeans on its side in order to see whether it can salvage whatever remains of the nuclear deal. It would demonstrate restraint, and that could be provide Israel with a favorable political situation to push further and diminish Iran's military capabilities and Hezbollah's military capabilities in Syria to the extent possible. And if Iran responds and retaliates, it provides Israel and President Trump with further justification to try to isolate Iran and put Iran under more economic and even military pressure.
Robbie, of course, fears have been rising for quite some time that if President Trump were to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, that it would escalate tensions in the region, that there might be this kind of a standoff. Do you believe this is a direct result of President Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal?
No, I think they're two separate issues. There's the President Trump, and Israel hasn't concealed that we welcome a renegotiation of the agreement. We think it could have been much better. The other issue, which is not connected, is the Iranian presence in military presence in Syria, and I don't think that is connected with the nuclear agreement. It's a military issue between Israel and Iran in Syria, and I think neither side wishes to escalate either of the issues.
Mohammed, there have been some members of Iran's parliament that have said that it is a fabrication, this charge that Israel has made that Iran fired rockets into the Golan Heights. But there was also a statement made by the Iranian Foreign Ministry in which they did not address those charges clearly. Why is that? Why haven't they clarified this issue?
Well, what I'm hearing from Iranian officials is that actually Iran is denying that they fired first. We have to remember that escalation is not in the interests of Iran. As was mentioned by the other guests, it's actually in the interests of Israel. Because I believe these two issues, the bombings in Syria as well as the nuclear issue, are actually completely related. Israel has been against this deal from the very beginning, and they are trying to lead Iran and the United States down a path of confrontation. Now, they were partly successful a few days ago when Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the deal. Nevertheless, Iran has indicated that it wants to continue the deal with the Europeans. Now, by escalating the tensions in the region, Israel is actually trying to kill the deal altogether.
All right, Robbie, for those who say that it was Israel that essentially pushed Trump to withdraw from the Iran deal, what's your reaction?
We certainly welcome it. In other words, we think it was a bad deal and a better deal can be negotiated. And we hope, in fact, that the economic pressure on Iran will lead to a better deal as it led to the earlier deal. But the second issue is simply an attempt by Iran to have military bases and rockets close to Israel's border in Syria. This is a pure tactical defense problem for Israel. I don't think it's connected to the major nuclear issue.
Ali, Germany, the UK, France, Russia, China, they all want to try to save the Iran nuclear deal. Is that a possibility at this point?
Well, you know, it is very difficult, but it's not impossible. It really depends on the level of political will that other members of the P5+1 now have to try to salvage the agreement. And so far, the signaling that they have made in the past few days has been quite positive and strong. We have to see whether they can put it into practice. Remember that the U.S. has an enormous weight in the global financial system. So without the U.S., Iran would definitely not be able to get most of the dividends of the nuclear deal. But the question now is whether the Europeans, who are the swing actors here, because the Russians and the Chinese, I think, will stay in the deal as long as Iran stays, but whether the Europeans are willing to enter into some degree of confrontation with the United States in order to help Iran get some of the dividends that was promised in the deal. We'll have to wait and see. There are negotiations starting between Iranian officials and European officials as of next week. And I think the fate of the agreement largely depends on the outcome of those negotiations, as well, obviously, as what happens in the region. And I add, the tensions are not just limited to the Golan Heights and the border between Israel and Syria. There is a lot of other friction in the region, including in Yemen, and the Saudis also seem to be moving in a direction of escalating by trying to take over the port of Hodeidah, which could also have a similar escalation and could easily spiral out of control there as well.
Robbie, if I could ask you to pick up a little bit on what Ali was saying there. He mentioned Saudi Arabia. Of course, in the last couple of days, we've heard Saudi officials, especially the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, Adel Jubeir, he said that if Iran were allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon, that Saudi Arabia would do the same. Do you think the region is headed towards an all-out arms race?
I think there's a great danger that if Iran were to obtain nuclear weapons, other states in the region would follow through. So there's two issues here. Israel obviously doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, and if it has it, we're likely to see a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, which could be catastrophic. Therefore, I think it's in the interest of everybody, except perhaps the revolutionary regime in Iran, to prevent Iran having nuclear weapons.
Mohammed, I want to go back to the issue of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, of course, President Rouhani has said that he'd like the deal to continue. He's going to be trying to ensure that that happens. But also, many see Trump withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal as really a gift to the hardliners in Iran. What's the view from Iran right now and the government as far as if there is a belief that the deal can in some form continue?
Yes, well, I mean, the Rouhani government has invested a lot of political capital in the nuclear deal. Rouhani actually came into power 5 years ago on a mandate to improve the economy via the nuclear deal. So that was his whole agenda. And now it seems very unlikely that Iran can actually continue this with the Europeans, because the Americans are imposing secondary sanctions that sanctions any company regardless of where they are. So the Rouhani government is trying to salvage it with the Europeans, but already there is a lot of criticism within Iran of this approach, and perhaps of taking a very soft approach to Donald Trump deciding to withdraw from the deal. Also, one point, if I may, regarding the previous discussion, I really don't think that Israel is concerned about Iran building a bomb. If they were, then they would actually welcome the deal, because the deal, the nuclear deal, has brought about unprecedented inspections of Iranian facilities. So scrapping the deal doesn't make sense if that's the viewpoint. Rather, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to lead this confrontation between Iran and the West. Every time Iranian relations with the US is improving, the Israelis always find a way to torpedo it. And this has been the deal for the past 4 decades.
Robbie, it looked like you might have wanted to say something there. Did you have a response to anything you heard from Mohammed saying just then?
I would like to respond. The deal postponed, and this is awfully important to emphasize, it postponed the possibility of Iran. It didn't end it. In other words, the agreement should have ended all possible attempts to reach a bomb. All they did was postpone it. And of course, they didn't touch the possibility, which Iran is developing, of ICBMs, which could deliver such weapons. Therefore, it was a flawed agreement. And we haven't concealed the fact. We feel it was a flawed agreement, and we hope a better agreement can be reached. But we do want to see an agreement, but it should be a better agreement than the previous agreement.
Ali, tensions are certainly at an all-time high between Iran and Israel right now, but has the fundamental dynamic between those countries actually changed at all?
No, and that's part of the reason that the nuclear deal did not survive the administration that followed the Obama administration. I really think that the context in which the nuclear crisis, which at the end of the day was an artificial crisis because Iran was years away from developing a nuclear weapon, even according to current U.S. Secretary of State, who said even before the deal, Iran was not dashing towards nuclear weapons. But the crisis around this issue was purely political and a function of disagreements between Iran and the U.S. that now date back to 4 decades. But let me say, I think even if we believe that the deal was imperfect, and all deals are by definition, I don't think the way to get a better deal was to destroy this one, because on the ruins of JCPOA, it's very hard to imagine that a stronger, bigger, and better deal could be built. Obviously, because with the JCPOA's collapse, the trust in the value of engaging with the United States has also completely disappeared in Iran. Because what's the point if from one administration to another, the U.S. changes its position entirely?
Mohammed, you were nodding your head there when Ali was speaking. Did you want to reply to any of the points he was making?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Iran has been obliging by its side of the deal. In the past 2.5 years, the IAEA has confirmed 10 times that Iran has fully complied with its end of the deal. However, the United States, even before a few days ago when they decided to withdraw, they have been very active in minimizing the economic benefits Iran was receiving. Right now in Iran, there's a lot of mistrust regarding the United States, even among reformists. When the United States is not keeping up its end of the bargain under the current deal, how can we even talk about a larger deal? What would prevent them from cheating or withdrawing from another deal? And if I may, regarding the issue of Israel accusing Iran of trying to build nuclear weapons, I don't think Israel is in a position to accuse Iran of anything. Israel is not a member of the NPT. They're the only country that has nuclear weapons in the region, and they weren't even party to the talks. And according to the JCPOA, the only party authorized to analyze Iranian compliance with the deal is the IAEA, and not Israel.
Robbie, I want to talk for a moment about Russia's role in all of this, because, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu traveled to Moscow this week. Now, when he was done with that trip, he said that he was confident that Russia would not prevent what he's calling Israel's freedom of action. But just a day later, it was a very different message that we were hearing from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who said that he was urging all sides to calm down and that this was a very dangerous escalation. Why the different messages coming out of Moscow on this?
I think one has to look at what are Russia's interests. Russia's interests are supporting the Assad regime. They've got a military base there, a naval base. It's very important for them. Iranian rockets in Syria is not within Russia's interests. So I think Russia's trying to play a careful path of continuing to support Assad, but not necessarily supporting Iranian rockets there. Obviously, Israeli attacks on Iranian rockets can be dangerous to Assad, and therefore it's the difficult political path for Russia. But I think that is a path they're trying to pursue. Support Assad, yet not necessarily support Iranian attempts to threaten Israel with rockets from Syrian territory.
Okay, Ali, you heard Robbie there talk about the threat of rockets. Let's shift to these reports that have been emerging the last few months that perhaps Russia was going to be in talks with the Syrian government about supplying these advanced S-300 ground-to-air missiles. Now there are reports emerging in Russian media that that is not the case, that Russia is not going to consider doing that. Do you believe that that's a direct result of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Moscow?
It is possible. I'm not privy to the details of those discussions, but Russia is playing a very delicate balancing act here, and it's the one actor that actually has leverage over the stakeholders and can potentially de-escalate the tensions, or at least if they break out, try to contain them. But let me add a point here that it's very hard to imagine that at the time that Iran wants to make sure that Assad can consolidate his power in Syria and take over as much of the territory that he has lost, that Iranians would welcome opening a new front against Israel. At this point, I think the priority for them is most likely consolidating Assad. Now, in the process, it's quite possible that they would try to improve Hezbollah's capabilities by providing them with guided missile technologies, and that's obviously a threat to Israel. But I doubt that the approach that at the moment Prime Minister Netanyahu has adopted, which is to push the Trump administration first to get out of the nuclear deal and then into some kind of military confrontation with Iran, would actually temper Iran's behavior. It is more likely that it would push Iran to double down on policies that from an Israeli perspective are problematic.
Okay, Robbie, you just heard Ali mention Hezbollah. That brings me to an important point, because obviously Hezbollah had these massive gains in the parliamentary election that was held in Lebanon just days ago. And once their victory was claimed, you had Israeli Education Minister Naftali Bennett saying publicly that now Israel equates Lebanon with Hezbollah. So is there right now a fear that Israel could launch another attack on Lebanon because of all that?
No, what we're afraid of is the Hezbollah will try and attack it, feeling that Lebanon can get away with it. And the message Israel's been trying to convey is that if Hezbollah attacked us, and they've got tens, if not hundreds of thousands of rockets aimed at Israel, then Lebanon will suffer. In other words, they can't have it both ways. They can't say, yes, we're part of the parliament of Lebanon, and yet Lebanon will get away free. So what we want to do is to deter. That Israel has no interest whatsoever in a military escalation, neither with Syria nor with Lebanon. But Hezbollah must know that if they do attack us, there will be a price to pay. And this, I think, was the message that we were trying to convey.
Hamid, how is all of this being reported in Iran right now? Is this being framed more as news of a conflict between Syria and Israel? How is it playing out in the media there?
I think there is concern in Iran of escalation. But mostly the nuclear issue has been the #1 news so far in Iran, not the issue of Syria, especially because of the fact that the Iranians are saying that the Israelis are exaggerating the impact of these attacks. For example, no Iranian casualty has been reported so far for the attacks that took place recently. So Iran is downplaying those, and the concern among the public is mostly about the nuclear deal. And regarding that, there is a lot of both frustration and anger, perhaps disappointment. But I wouldn't necessarily say there's a lot of surprise, because Donald Trump has been against this deal from the very beginning, as well as the Israelis. Essentially, what you have is you have Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States on one side being against the deal, and the whole world, including Iran, on the other being for the deal.
Ali, if this turns into an actual conflict, just how much does Iran stand to lose?
A lot, but I think so does everybody else. And that's why I think no one really wants a full-fledged war. But I think Iran's rivals in the region would welcome the U.S. bloodying Iran's nose, because from their perspective, Iran is in ascendance in the region, and it needs to be cut down to size. And the only power that can do that, which has escalation domination and would potentially at some stage push the Iranians to stop escalating any further, is the United States. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Israelis actually killed about 7 Iranian military personnel in the T4 base in Syria a few weeks ago. And the Iranians have not retaliated, at least not so far, which demonstrates that they see a value in demonstrating restraint at this point. They might eventually retaliate one way or another, but the fact that they are demonstrating restraint is part of this larger calculation of trying to consolidate Assad's power as the first priority in Syria, and then second, try to salvage the nuclear agreement with the Europeans and other members of the P5+1. And I think Israel sees some space in Iranian restraint to try to push the envelope to the extent possible, and that is a dangerous game.
Robbie, any response to what Ali was just saying there about the Iranians showing restraint?
I think the Iranian government has to choose. It can either invest in its economy, which was the reason it went into the agreement, or it can continue to try and escalate affairs in the Middle East. They can't have it both. And I hope that the Iranian government will decide it's in its interest to develop its economy, to renegotiate the agreement, to stop trying to threaten Israel, and it can become an economic powerhouse. It really can. But it can't at the same time threaten Israel and bring in rockets and then hope to have its economy developed. It has to make the choice. And I hope for the sake of the Iranian people, it makes the correct choice.
All right, gentlemen, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Mohammed Mousavi, Robbie Sabel, and Ali Vayez. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.